Okay, so you guys did what we call a web quest, where you go on to a website and you just fill in some of the answers to the questions that the paper asks. And we're talking about the Oregon Trail. And we're talking about the Oregon Trail because there were no trains, there were no vehicles, there were really no other way to get from one place to another other than walking or riding some sort of animal. And so the Oregon Trail was a long trip, and people wanted to leave where they were on the East Coast and head to the West Coast. All right, so this is just a picture of a covered wagon without its cover on it. Okay. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to read you a brief history of the Oregon Trail. And I want you to listen to what I'm talking about and envision yourself there. Okay. Envision yourself with no electricity, no internet, no vehicle, no trains, no planes, no automobiles, anything like that. All right. The Oregon Trail was a major migration across North America in the mid 1800s. It was a 2,000-mile journey that became a passage to the land of plenty for many of the immigrants who traveled it. They hoped that it would lead them to more freedom, good farmland, better health, or to escape poverty. Dreams drove their journey, but for some, the dream died. During this era, nearly 1 of every 20 Americans relocated west of the Missouri River. Though many found adventure and success on their journey, the trail was full of tragic encounters and testing times. The road to the west, known as the Oregon Trail, began as a series of trails used by Native Americans and fur traders. Its first real immigrant traffic came in 1843 when a wagon train of about 1,000 people left Independence, Missouri, bound for Oregon. From that time on, the Oregon Trail saw hundreds of thousands of travelers until the late 1860s, when a transcontinental railroad offered new ways to reach the West. The start of the journey basically followed the Platte River through present-day Nebraska. To the northwest loomed the Great Rocky Mountains, and to the south lay the desert. So what they're saying is you either had to go through some crazy mountains or some very crazy desert area, and this trip was not going to be easy no matter what. The Platte River offered a central corridor, so that means like a central travel way, to those heading to the west. Much of this land was already occupied by Native Americans. The Pawnee, Kansas, Cheyenne, Arapaho, the Lakota Sioux, the Shoshone, the Bannock, the Nez Perce, the Cayuse, the Walla Walla, the Umatilla, and the Chinook were some of the nations that were populating this vast area. So you'll remember that a lot of Native Americans that were on the East Coast were already relocated west of the Mississippi. And then there was already Native American tribes there. So there was quite a few tribes along the Oregon Trail. Pioneers were called immigrants as they were relocating out of the United States into frontier territory. So the United States, right? We had the 13 original states, then we bought the Louisiana Territory. And if you were going to go further west than that, it was just called the frontier territory. They journeyed up the Platte River to the North Platte, then to the Sweetwater River, which led them to South Pass. From South Pass, their routes went either along the Snake and Columbia Rivers to Oregon or the Humboldt River toward California. Independence and St. Joseph, Missouri were common jumping off places. Large numbers of immigrants gathered there before heading toward the west. It was kind of like the place where they all met and then went on the journey. That was called the jumping off place. This was the place to make sure your outfit was fully assembled and equipped. All right. And when we're talking about an outfit, we're talking about the wagon and the animals that pulled all your stuff. And that was really a very important part of your trip, because if you got good animals and a good wagon, you might have a real successful trip. If you had questionable animals and a rickety wagon, well, you might not make it. A wagon, draft animals, food, tools, and clothing were gathered together to sustain a family for up to 5 or 6 months of trail travel and camping out. So you had to pack enough that was going to last you 5 or 6 months. That's a lot in a wagon. So now we're going to go over what draft animals are. The Oregon Trail migrations happened before the invention of automobiles or the existence of railroad lines. So draft animals provided the power. Oxen were the number one draft animal of the migrations. About 80% of the wagons in 1850 were hauled by these beasts of burden. And oxen, I don't know if you can see that right there, they almost kind of look like cows. They're like bigger than cows, okay? And they usually have horns, and they're very strong and very beefy. All right. Why oxen instead of horses? Well, horses were expensive and their upkeep was demanding. Horses needed grain to supplement their diet and were bothered by insects and bad weather, where mules were also a popular choice. They were strong, they were tough, they could move at a fairly fast pace, and they were able to survive on grass available along the trail. But mules, they were also expensive and in short supply, and sometimes had a contrary nature that made them difficult to control. Have you ever met a donkey that doesn't want to move? Well, when a donkey doesn't want to move, it doesn't move. So Plains Indians and rustlers sometimes stole horses and mules. Oxen, they weren't so tempting to the thieves. Oxen were slow, but they were very strong and they were adaptable to the weather and to the food, and they were calm. They survived on the dry prairie grasses. Oxen were much cheaper, and if things got bad on the trail, you could slaughter your ox for beef to feed your hungry group. It was best to have at least 4 oxen to pull each wagon, and if possible, a spare pair would be taken along. Oxen hooves required attention, and shoes were applied to their feet to protect them. If iron shoes were not available, immigrants nailed sole leather on the bottoms of the oxen's feet, or they smeared the hoofs with tar or grease, and they fastened on the boots made of buffalo hide. Families had great affection for their oxen, often giving them names. And when oxen died, the whole family grieved as though a family member had been lost. So we've talked a lot about things that didn't make it all the way, and quite possibly these oxen had to be slaughtered along the way. It would have been very sad for the family. So now we're talking about the wagons. Wagons used on the Oregon Trail were not the huge boat-shaped Conestoga type wagons, but they were more of a reinforced farm wagon. They were capable of hauling anywhere from 1,600 to 2,500 pounds. Cargoes were protected with bows reaching about 5 feet above the wagon bed and covered with some type of heavy canvas-like material. And that was kind of the picture that I showed you at the beginning. These are the bows above the wagon. And then they put canvas on top of that, and it would cover whatever you put inside the wagon. Spare parts, like spokes for the wheels and axles for the wheels, were carried and often slung underneath the wagon bed. And then they had grease buckets, heavy rope, and chains completed the running gear and accessories. When store-bought grease, which is necessary for wheels to keep going, right? It's really dusty on that trail. And so you need to have grease to keep everything running and spinning. When store-bought grease was exhausted, they boiled buffalo or they used the grease from a wolf to grease those tires. So now we're going to talk about supplies. In preparing supplies, a delicate balance was necessary. Hauling too much would tear down the animals, and too little could result in starvation or deprivation. So if you didn't bring enough, you weren't going to make it. And if you brought too much, it was going to be too hard on your animals. Food was the most important supply. I'm going to say that again. Food was the most important supply. Wild berries, roots, greens, and fish might supplement your diet, but it was too risky to depend on those things. Hunting or foraging on the dry plains was good some days, but yielded nothing on other days. In some places along the trail, immigrants bartered with the Indians for game, salmon, and vegetables in exchange for tools and clothing. Prior to 1849, there were few stores or trading posts along the route. So basically, if you left and you went, you better have everything you need in your wagon. Early guidebooks recommended that each immigrant be supplied with 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of coffee, 20 pounds of sugar, and 10 pounds of salt. Basic quick kitchen equipment consisted of a cooking kettle, a frying pan, a coffee pot, tin plates, cups, knives, and forks. Provisions were of vital importance to the immigrant. So provisions are the things that you bring to survive on, okay? Food had to be preserved so that it would not spoil along the trail. Okay, food that not spoil for 5 or 6 months. Preserved food included drying, smoking, or pickling. Bread, bacon, and coffee were the staple diet during the entire trip. Dried beans, rice, dried fruit, tea, vinegar, pickles, and saleratus, that's baking soda, were frequent supplies. Camping supplies such as tents, rain tarps, blankets, and bedrolls were included. Each immigrant needed some sturdy clothing and a hat to shield themselves from the harsh weather and the burning sun. Many carried a firearm for hunting and protection, and basic tools for cutting wood and making minor repairs. There was only a little room for the non-essential supplies: favorite books, a musical instrument, art supplies, fancy clothes, or tools for setting up a new home in the West had to be squeezed in any available space in the wagon. Many goods were discarded along the trail when the heavy wagons needed to be lightened to save their exhausted animals. While pioneer women were used to baking bread at home, it took some experimenting to bake bread in a Dutch oven, which they're like pots with lids on them like this, and you could put them on the coals of a fire, and then inside it, it kind of acted like an oven. And some people still use Dutch ovens to this day when they can't. Dried hardback biscuits were also a common provision to last the 5-month journey. The food supply was the heaviest and the most essential part of the covered wagon trip. Some pioneers brought a few chickens along in cages and they tied them to the side of the wagon, but otherwise, there were no eggs. Many, especially those with small children, brought a milk cow. Milk and butter were a health-giving supplement to a family diet of mainly meat and bread. All right, so now we're going to talk about traveling along the trail. And it's all the way here in Missouri. I don't even know if you can see that map. Missouri, and then this goes to the West Coast. Lots of states. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 really large states they had to cross. The standard date for departure for the jumping off was April 15th, give or take a week or two. Any earlier and the trail was too muddy. Any later and the prairie grasses would be overgrazed, and the pioneers risked meeting a terrible winter. And a terrible winter in weather could also cause you to not be able to be successful. Expected arrival in Oregon or California was mid-September to early October. An ideal crossing was 120 days for the 2,000-mile trip with a daily average of 15 miles a day. So that's about halfway to Fernley, just before maybe Hazen or so. So you would have to do that by foot every single day for several months. A more realistic crossing took 2 to 4 weeks longer than this estimate. And on a good day, more than 15 miles could be covered at top oxen speed of about 2 miles per hour. On a bad day with river crossings or bad weather, well, you could make much less than 2 miles. In many wide open places, wagon trains broke up into 2 or more columns. So there was trains full of wagons and animals, and they were just walking side by side. The day usually started at sunrise and lasted until early evening with 1 hour rest at noon. This nooning, that's what they called it, was essential because it gave man, woman, and the oxen a much needed rest. The oxen were not unyoked. That means they didn't take off their equipment that pulled the wagon. They just kept it on them. And then they were allowed to graze. They would detach the oxen. They would keep their equipment on, but then they could maybe eat some grass. Immigrants were always on the lookout for the perfect campsite with water, firewood, and grass for grazing their animals. Good campsites were well known and well used. The first order of business at the end of the day was forming a corral by pulling the wagons into a circle. It was normally a circular or maybe kind of like an oval oblong shape with the tongue of one wagon chained to the rear of the neighbor's next wagon. And then that kind of formed a fence. Originally designed to form a corral for some of the livestock, it became an institution as much for companionship as anything else. So not only did it keep the animals in, but it kind of kept them into a circle, kind of kept them close. Maybe they could share fires and get to know each other. The evening campfire provided comforting warmth, a place to dry wet clothes, and to cook a hot supper. While river bottoms along the trail are thick with trees today, 150 years ago, frequent prairie fires kept the trees from maturing. How did these immigrants keep warm or fry their bacon or bake their bread? This was accomplished by burning driftwood, breaking up the occasional abandoned wagon box, or twisting dry grass into tight bundles. When crossing buffalo country, the pioneers burned dry buffalo chips, the dried bison dung, sometimes called prairie coal. So that is the poop of a buffalo. When it was dried out, they could also burn that if they couldn't find trees. Now we're going to talk about traveling conditions, okay? Water was important along the entire length of the trail, and the route followed rivers as much as possible. Along the Platte River, travelers described the muddy water as too thick to drink and too thin to plow. Some tried to filter out the sand and other particles that was found in the river water by straining the water through fabric. Some boiled their water, not so much to ensure its safety, but to kill the wiggly tails. Drinking untreated water caused a lot of sickness and death on the trail. Springs also provided watering spots, but alkali springs were poisonous to man and animals and were marked with warning signs. In some stretches of trail, especially through Idaho and eastern Oregon or the Nevada desert, immigrants had to haul their water for long stretches between rivers and springs. The Oregon migrations were a family affair, sometimes with at least 50% women and children. There were courting and marriages among the young and unmarried members of numerous wagon trains, and babies were born on the journey too. Interestingly, those who kept diaries made no mention of an impending birth until a short entry announced the arrival of a new member of the family, which means people that kept records of these long wagon trains, they never really talked about women being pregnant. And then all of a sudden they see this historical document and then boom, all of a sudden a baby is added. And so probably wasn't that big a deal to be pregnant and possibly consider giving birth while on the Oregon Trail. But tragically, the chance of death for both a mother and an infant during childbirth was very high. Sleeping arrangements were elementary and primitive. Sick persons or small children might sleep in the wagon, but the most common bed was a blanket, a piece of canvas, or a buffalo robe on the ground. Some people had tents, but they often blew away in the wind, or they were so cumbersome to deal with that they were just discarded along the way. Immigrants had no trouble falling asleep. Fatigue and exhaustion made the ground seem soft and quite welcome to lay down upon after a long day walking. Given the extremes which tested the immigrants to their limits, the evidence of crime among the travelers was actually pretty low. Under the circumstances, the vast majority of folks behaved pretty good. There were no civil laws. There were no marshals. That means there were no sheriffs, no police. There were no courts of law to protect those who crossed the plains. The military did offer some protection near the forts, but it was limited, and wagon trains carried out their own justice and kind of made their own laws. Native Americans living along the route were wary of the travelers crossing their territory, and many of the pioneers had read propaganda that depicted Native Americans as hostile and dangerous, and so were fearful. Propaganda is stories or advertisements that the government creates. And so the government kind of said, if you go at your own risk. And so they made it sound like some of the Native American tribes were hostile. Let's see. Some hostile incidents did occur over the 30 or more years of the migration, which eventually led to more fear and suspicion of the Native Americans. This increased as pioneers became settlers, and conflicts for land and resources led to problems and difficult relations. So not everybody went all the way to the West Coast. Some people just stopped and they decided to start right there, try to build a home on the plains. And there was some conflict with some Native American tribes. Religion played a large role in the westward migration for a majority of these pioneers. They were devout Christian churchgoers. While it was not practical to lay over every Sunday while traveling the trail, some sort of Sabbath observance was often held. So normally on Sundays, they wouldn't just stop, but they would do something to try to create church. All right. Now, it says many pioneers recorded their experiences in diaries or journals, which were later shared with many friends. They also wrote in their Bibles. These personal writings indicate that pioneers experienced many tedious days and many hardships, but they also enjoyed taking short walks and exploring new land. They expressed their wonderment at the huge herds of bison and the unfamiliar wildlife, like a pronghorn or a prairie dog or even a coyote. The vast open landscapes were different from their homes in the East. They wrote of prairie entertainment like playing music, playing games and cards, and celebrating the holidays such as the 4th of July. Children might play games such as tag, but many had to leave their toys behind. Songs such as "Oh Susanna" and "Home Sweet Home" were popular during the pioneer days, especially among the pioneers that were feeling homesick. So, and then we're going to talk about hardships. While some people seemed to thrive on the excitement and the adventure of their journey across the plains, others, it was just an ordeal. After surviving untold hardships, there arose the threat of disease and death. Statistics on the number of immigrants and the number of deaths on the trail vary widely. Different historians have estimated between 200,000 and 500,000 people crossed that long Oregon Trail, and 20,000 to 30,000 deaths occurred along that 2,000-mile trail, averaging 10 or more graves per mile. Remember, we talked about, I know that Jameson, you'll probably like this. It says rest in peace right here. We talked about if somebody died along the trail, they just buried them right there along the road. Often the deaths occurred from poor sanitation practices in cooking and in food storage, bad water, and bad living conditions. Some people suffered from consumption or tuberculosis, and they tried to make the trip because it was believed that outdoor exercise would help overcome the disease. What better exercise than walking across the entire prairie? Pneumonia, whooping cough, measles, and smallpox, various other sicknesses also caused many deaths. Cholera, which is a contagious bacterial disease, was the greatest killer of all, and they get that in the water. Accidents associated with wagon travel also took their toll. Drowning, being run over by a dragon, accidental shootings, and accidents from handling the animals caused injuries, maiming, and even death. And fatigue was often resulted in carelessness, and it led to other accidents. The weather played a key role in trail life and was one which simply had to be endured. Basically, whatever weather was there, obviously you just had to get through it. April and May could be cold and wet, and since the immigrants traveled with a meager supply of clothes and bedding, it was very uncomfortable. Later, heat and dust became their enemy. When it rained, low places became bogs where wagons could get sucked down and they couldn't get out. And then, if it rained a lot, some rivers had to be crossed while it was just really, really wavy and crazy. It was tiring to walk 10 to 15 miles per day, and children were constantly looking for firewood along the way. Men drove the animals, and they did the heavy work of repairing wagons and managing the river crossings. and were always on the lookout for a chance to hunt for fresh meat. Women were responsible for setting up camp, preparing food morning, noon, and night, and they broke camp down to reload the wagons when it was time to get back on the road. After surviving the Great Prairies and the Rocky Mountains, making their way along the Sweetwater and Snake Rivers, the Blue Mountains still had to be crossed. Many found the road through the Blues more difficult than crossing the Rockies. Travelers then journeyed across northeastern Oregon to the Columbia River. Some historians say that the Oregon Trail ended at the Dalles, but most believe it's true to end at Oregon City. After reaching the Dalles, wagons floated down the Columbia on the rafts, and in 1846, the Barlow Road was built around Mount Hood, giving travelers an alternative river travel. So as more people kept traveling, more routes at the further you got west were available. And this is it. Finally, the Valley of Willamette. Located here was the land office where you could file your land claim. Here, hopes and dreams either blossomed, and they bore fruit, or they died. Those who had endured the incredible hardships of the journey, now behind them, came to this valley so they could seize the land, settle it, come to terms with it, and call it their home. Arriving exhausted from the journey and with very few supplies left, many struggled through their first years, but many also found that the new life and the new opportunity was worth it. All right, so I know that was a lot. I'm telling you that you can go back and listen to any part you want to. We talked about what draft animals were and why they used oxen instead of donkeys and horses. We talked about what the wagons looked like with the bows and the canvas over it and how many pounds could be in those wagons. We talked about what supplies were necessary. We talked about that long travel across the trail and how people got sick and people died. We talked about the traveling conditions. We talked about religion, and we talked about a little bit about the Native Americans. And then we talked about what happened when you actually made it all the way. So your next assignment has to do with what I just read and what you learned in the WebQuest. And you're going to need to write a paper, at least a one-page story, and you're going to put you with your family crossing that 2,000-mile trip, which is 4 to 6 months, and you're going to make up a story about your trip. You also have to include one hardship in your story. So you'll go up to the teacher, you'll roll a dice, and whether you get a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, or a 6, she will tell you what your hardship is. And then you need to include that hardship in your story. Type it in Google Docs and submit it in this assignment. I look forward to reading them.